Well, hi there, and welcome back to Her Shrink Ray Eye. I'm Joan Biediger, and the more I look at miniature work, the more aware I am of its strange relationship with time. Miniatures are completely still, and yet some of them make us feel that something has just happened, is about to happen, or has been going on for a very long time. Some present a frozen moment. Others suggest a longer stretch of time. That difference is what I want to explore today. I don't mean time in the sense of how many hours we spend at the bench or how long it takes to get the paint where we want it. I mean time as something a miniature can suggest. Some miniatures present a condition. Everything is there, everything is visible, the scene feels complete. Others feel like part of something larger, as though what we are seeing is just one point within a longer stretch of time. When that happens, a miniature starts to feel less like an object and more like a moment. Not a fixed state, but something connected to what came before it and what may follow. Even when nothing dramatic is happening, the space can feel as though time has been moving through it long before we arrived. A miniature can be quiet, even uneventful, and still suggest a larger world. The pieces that tend to stay with us the longest generally do not rely on spectacle. They give us just enough to imagine what extends beyond what is shown. Miniature art is made slowly and often viewed relatively quickly. It compresses long stretches of time into one very small visible space, and yet the most interesting miniatures resist being taken in all at once. They make us feel as though we have interrupted something rather than simply observed it. I've been thinking that this may be one of the deepest things miniatures do. They change the way time is felt inside a scene. They allow us to hold a fragment of time still long enough to examine it. Is this a moment after use, before action, after damage? When does something start to fail? All of those questions are really ways of asking where in time this scene has been placed. Once you start thinking in those terms, what first looks like atmosphere, realism, or even storytelling begins to shift. When a miniature gives you a strong sense of where the scene sits in time, it starts to feel less like something arranged and more like something lived. That may sound a little dramatic, but I don't think it's that abstract. We're not seeing time directly. We're reading it through traces, patterns, and interruption. We stand in front of something static, but mentally we begin moving backward into what led here and forward into what might follow. The object remains still, but the viewer does not. And that to me is where something interesting starts to happen. A miniature becomes more than a small, crafted thing sitting on a table. It becomes a fragment of time you can enter, a kind of handheld time machine. A miniature does not have to literally move to give us a sense of movement through time. We often describe miniatures by what they depict: a figure, a vehicle, a historical scene. But when you spend time with them, the visible scene can start to feel like only part of what is there. You begin to sense that something has already happened here or is about to happen. A tool left out implies interrupted work. A worn patch on the floor marks where someone always stands. Each detail tells us the moment did not begin when we first looked at it. There is a real difference between a scene that looks arranged and one that looks interrupted. An interrupted scene suggests prior activity. That is when the viewer begins to feel that the moment belongs to a longer stretch of time. What I find so compelling is how subtle this can be. We often assume that a sense of time comes from dramatic action, a battle, an explosion, something clearly in motion. And those things can carry time strongly, but a much quieter scene can do it just as well. A coffee cup beside an open notebook. Maybe it's a drawer not quite closed. These are transitional moments, and transition is one of the clearest ways a still scene begins to feel part of a longer stretch of time. We don't look at an in-between moment without trying to complete it in our heads. A pose that feels slightly unstable suggests the next adjustment. A detail that feels out of place suggests what just happened. The response is not just poetic, it's part of how we process images. Even in something completely still, we look for continuation. This is related to story, but it's not the same thing. A miniature can suggest temporal extension even when almost nothing is happening. Maybe it's a broken toy, a tool left out after use. None of those things requires a full narrative. A miniature does not become convincing because it contains a lot. It becomes convincing because what it contains points beyond itself. How does time show up in a miniature? It appears through worn surfaces, interrupted gestures, and the way objects sit in relation to one another. A chipped edge on a table, a patch on a sleeve. Maybe it's that threshold worn down by repeated crossing. These are not just visual details. They are traces that tell us the scene has already been changed by what happened there. Another sign of time is unfinished action. A figure turning but not yet turned. A hand reaching but not yet grasping. These are moments caught in transition. They place the viewer in the middle of something rather than at the end of it. A finished state tends to register all at once. A transitional one tends to hold the eye longer. Time also shows up through repetition. Some of the strongest evidence of time has nothing to do with dramatic events. It has to do with routine, habit, and repeated use. A path worn across the yard, a workbench that is clean in one area and cluttered where the work actually happens. Those details tell us not just that time passed, but how it passed. Once you start looking for that, a miniature begins to feel less arranged and more lived in. Realism plays a role here, but it's not the whole explanation. A piece can be extremely realistic in its surfaces and still feel oddly sealed off. It may tell us very little about use, repetition, or change. A miniature can be simple and still full of time if it makes those patterns visible. Weathering works when it has logic. Dirt everywhere does not show time. Chipping all over does not show use. Time leaves patterns. Once you start thinking this way, you begin making different decisions. You stop asking only what belongs in the scene. You start asking what's been repeated, postponed, worn out, cared for, or left alone. Those are design questions, but they are also time questions. This becomes especially clear in historical miniature work. On the surface, historical modeling can look as though it is mainly about accuracy. Dates, uniforms, equipment, and paint colors. The right objects in the right place at the right moment. Research matters, specificity matters. If the visible facts are wrong, the piece loses a certain kind of credibility. But accuracy and a real sense of lived time are not the same thing. Historical miniature work is sometimes praised as though correctness alone were enough. And correctness can absolutely be impressive, but even a highly accurate piece can still feel oddly distant, as if it's sitting behind glass. I think that happens when historical work reconstructs information without reconstructing lived time. It gives us the look of the past without much sense of how life moved inside it. That, to me, is where historical miniature work either becomes deeply compelling or stays merely admirable. Because the past has never lived as a neat arrangement of reference details. It was lived as repetition, wear, and routine. People did not inhabit history as a category. They inhabited moments, long stretches of ordinary time, punctuated by harder, stranger, and more consequential ones. I think some of the most convincing historical pieces are the ones that resist dramatic overstatement. Maybe it's a soldier adjusting his gear, a mechanic pausing beside a machine, a field position that shows routine more than battle. Those scenes may not announce themselves as major events, but they often feel more persuasive because they give us access to the texture of lived time rather than the spectacle of recorded history. This is why wear matters so much in historical work when it's done well. Not because age automatically makes something interesting, and not because every old object should be battered, but because specific wear can show us how time moved through that world. A handle polished by use, a repaired strap, a path across a floor that reveals repeated movement. Those details do not just tell us that time passed, they suggest what kind of time passed. Historical miniature work becomes much more persuasive when time is represented not just as a date, but as routine, wear, and lived experience. The scene begins to feel less like an arrangement of researched parts and more like a small opening into a world that existed before we arrived and would continue after we left. That, to me, is where the phrase time travel begins to feel earned. Not because the miniature literally returns us to the past, but because it gives us more than historical costume and surface recognition. It gives us briefly a way to feel how time was being lived inside that world. Memory and decay are part of this as well, and are often treated as style in miniature work, atmosphere, mood, a certain look. But one of the things miniatures do especially well is make time visible as accumulation, not just aging, but the uneven buildup of use, repair, and neglect. Perfect consistency rarely gives us that. Perfect consistency suggests control, but lived environments usually do not behave that way for very long. Time does not touch everything equally. That unevenness is one of the clearest ways time becomes visible. It's very easy to add aging to a miniature. It's much harder to make aging feel specific. Random chips, generic grime, evenly distributed dust, and arbitrary rust can create a look, but they do not necessarily create a sense of time. That is where memory enters the work, not memory in the sentimental sense necessarily, but memory as material trace, the record left behind when something has happened repeatedly enough to shape a place. Maybe it's a work surface with old cuts beneath newer paint, a fireplace that's surrounded by soot from repeated use. Those details suggest that the visible scene did not just appear all at once. It formed gradually. It absorbed use. It adapted. It endured. A dramatic event may capture attention immediately, but residue lingers. It asks quieter questions. Who lived here? What was done here over and over? What mattered enough to maintain? What was no longer worth fixing? That is one reason abandoned spaces hold so much fascination in miniature form. Abandonment is not just decay, it's time continuing without correction. A maintained place still bears the marks of time, but those marks are constantly being negotiated, cleaned, patched, repaired. A neglected place reveals what happens when that negotiation stops. When no one inhabits or maintains a space, it begins to show what time does on its own, unevenly and without mercy. That can be visually dramatic, yes, but what makes it compelling is not just the ruin. It's the sense of time that has passed without anyone interrupting it. You feel the density of unattended time. Some miniatures feel oddly empty because they feel untouched by time, not lived in, not abandoned, not maintained, and not neglected. They exist in a kind of vacuum. A suspended moment is not the same thing as a vacuum. A suspended moment still carries momentum. Something led into it. Something could follow it. Time has not stopped. It's only been held for a moment. A vacuum feels disconnected from what led into it and what might follow. It feels as though nothing has happened there long enough to matter. That is one reason memory and decay matter so much in this conversation. They reconstruct the miniature to a longer stretch of time. They give the scene a history of contact. They make time uneven, and because of that, believable. I think this is also why certain details in miniature work can hit with surprising force even when they are very restrained. A sagging chair cushion, a worn windowsill, a faded sign. These are not grand symbols, but they carry a quiet human weight because they suggest repeated life. Maybe that's part of why I keep returning to it. So much of what time does is not dramatic enough to be narrated, but it's still powerful enough to shape everything. It settles into objects, rooms, routines, repairs, and habits. Miniatures can hold those traces in a way that feels unusually intimate. At this point, I can probably say more clearly what I mean by that phrase, the handheld time machine. At its best, a miniature becomes a way of entering time through space. A miniature can take a still arrangement of objects, figures, and surfaces and make the viewer move through time in their imagination. We begin reconstructing what came before and sensing what might happen next. Smallness is part of the fascination, but it does not fully explain the power of miniatures. What makes them compelling is that they condense time as well as space. A miniature can do in a few square inches what memory often does in the mind. It can compress, select, and preserve certain traces while leaving other things out. The phrase time machine is not just poetic exaggeration. In the imaginative sense, a time machine is simply something that lets us move beyond the immediate present into another sense of time. Miniatures do that all the time. A historical miniature can let us sense the pace and pressure of a world no longer present. An abandoned room can let us feel a long stretch of unattended time. A worn object can let us imagine years of handling compressed into one visible surface. Even a very simple scene can do this if it holds enough evidence of time. In a full-size environment, time is often something we move through without noticing. A miniature isolates a fragment and holds it at a scale where we can study it more deliberately. It gives us both distance and intimacy at once. Miniatures ask us to do more than recognize. They ask us to reconstruct and infer. That gap between what is shown and what is suggested is where time becomes active. A completely closed image gives us very little room to travel. A stronger miniature makes us feel that more exists beyond what we can see. A miniature does not usually show long stretches of time directly. It condenses them into surfaces, repairs, and traces. That is one reason small scenes can feel unexpectedly vast. Maybe that is where the real wonder comes in. A miniature can make time portable. It can take something sprawling like history, memory, or slow decline and give it shape in a space small enough to study closely. That to me is what some of the best miniature work does. It gives us that fragment of time dense enough to enter, a small handheld time machine. Once I started thinking about miniatures this way, it changed the questions I ask while I'm working. Not all at once, it was more gradual than that, but I began noticing something specific. When a piece felt flat to me, the problem was not always technical. For a long time, I think I probably would have responded to that by trying to improve the finish. Add something, refine something, push the realism a little further. And sometimes that is the right answer. Sometimes, though, what is missing is not more information, it's more time. Instead of asking only whether the piece looks right, I try to ask what kind of time the scene seems to belong to. Does it feel complete or interrupted? What's been repeated often enough to leave a mark? What's been maintained and what's been neglected? Those questions do not always lead to adding more. Sometimes they lead to removing something, leaving something unresolved, shifting a pose slightly, or changing where wear appears and how specific it needs to be. It has also made me more aware of the finishing choices I make by habit. A wash because it's expected, chipping because it looks realistic, extra objects because a bare space feels risky. A miniature does not become richer simply by becoming denser. It becomes richer when the visible choices start making sense in time. Why is this area worn and not that one? Why is this object out of place? Why is this corner cleaner than the rest? Those are demanding questions, but they often lead to better decisions. They also slow me down in a useful way. They pull me out of that urge to finish for the sake of finishing and push me back towards observation and what the piece is actually trying to hold. I think that is especially helpful whenever a project starts losing energy. A stall at the bench can look like a craftsmanship problem when it's really a time problem. Everything may have appeared at once instead of arriving through use, event, or repetition. Once I suspect that, the questions change. Does the pose need more transition? Does the space need more signs of repeated use? Does one area need to show care while another shows neglect? Those questions don't guarantee success, but they are often more productive than simply pushing the finish further. It also changes how I look at reference. Instead of using reference only to verify what something looked like, I find myself paying more attention to temporal clues within it. Where has the surface changed and why? What's been handled most? What appears maintained because it matters and what appears neglected? That kind of looking feels different. It's less about inventory and more about use, wear, and repetition. I think that matters because miniatures are so often built from parts. Separate objects, separate textures, separate decisions. It's very easy for those decisions to remain divided. What time does when it's handled well is tie those choices together. Time connects things. It connects the pose to the surface to the routine, and the routine to the larger life of the space. And once those things begin to feel connected, the miniature starts to feel more convincing. It's not necessarily more elaborate, it just feels more coherent in time. That's what I think I'm more interested in right now. I want the materials, gestures, and arrangements of a piece to feel shaped by the same world. That doesn't mean every miniature has to become an essay on time. Some pieces are playful, some are theatrical or highly stylized, some are about precision, some are about spectacle. All of that is part of what makes miniature art so rich and interesting. But even then, I think the question still helps. What kind of moment is this piece really about? Once that question enters the process, it becomes very hard to ignore. I think part of why this matters to me so much is that I have never been entirely comfortable with how quickly things disappear. Moments pass before we understand them. Experiences collapse into memory almost immediately. There is something almost defiant about stopping a clock on purpose. Miniature work lets us do that. It lets us hold a fragment of time still, long enough to examine it, not to preserve it perfectly, and not to escape reality, but to look at it more closely. The world moves very fast, and most of the time we're asked to move quickly with it, to skim, to react, to move on. Miniature work asks something else. It asks for sustained looking. It asks us to stay with a fragment a little longer than usual. And when that fragment has real temporal depth, something else happens. We begin reconstructing what led here, what has been repeated, what has been neglected, and what may already be slipping away. That is one reason I resist reducing miniature work to decoration or craftsmanship alone. Craftsmanship matters, beauty matters, but miniatures can also make time feel tangible. Not every piece does this, and not every piece needs to. Some miniatures work through color, precision, or sheer visual force. There's room for all that. But the work that stays with me is usually the work that gives me some sense of time still active inside it. Not just shown, but felt. Maybe that's the heart of what I've been trying to get at in this episode. Miniatures take something expansive like history or memory and compress it into a scale small enough to study closely. To me, that's where the handheld time machine exists, in the ability of miniature work to interrupt the present and make another sense of time briefly available. That's where miniatures stop being objects on a table and start becoming places we can enter, even if only for a moment. Before I sign off today, I want to thank the Shepherd Payne Education Fund for their support of this podcast and their commitment to education in the miniature arts. Until next time, keep your hands steady, see clearly, nod obediently, and keep your story your own. Thanks for spending this time with me.